In this video, I'm going to talk about configuring password settings in the Active Directory. Now, configuring password settings is oftentimes something that is fairly simple and easy to do, but can have some complicated aspects to it that you kind of have to pay attention to. So what we're going to do, pretty much just jump into Active Directory group policies and see what the current settings are, as well as then change some of those settings to see how they affect our end users. So without any waste, let's go ahead and jump on in. This system I have right here is a domain controller. If we look at local server, it is a domain controller for a domain called test2016.local. I just built out this machine. If we actually open up Active Directory users and computers, we will find that there is nobody created in here. This is pretty much the default fresh install. So with that said, well, let's look at our Active Directory password policies. To look at the password policies for Active Directory, we have to go into our group policy editor. And it's going to be back through Server Manager. We go to Tools, and we're looking for Group Policy Management. You can get to this from another way. If you go out to the run command and you type in gpmc.msc, that will also open up the Group Policy Management console. So the management console we're looking for, let's actually zoom in a little bit more. Sorry, the setting we're looking for is in the forest and under the domain. And the policy we're looking for here is the default domain policy. So I can either get to it by clicking on here, ignoring that, and then say right click and edit, or I can look under the group policy objects and see that there is in fact the default domain policy. This guy up here is just simply a link to that default domain policy. One thing to note, as you can see right here, we have a default domain controllers policy and a default domain policy. These get very confusing. It is very common for people to click the wrong one, so make sure you're in the right location. So I'm going to go ahead and edit the default domain policy, which is where the default password settings are defined. These default password settings are going to be under computer configuration, policies, Windows settings, security settings, and account policies is where we start. We'll talk about the password policy first, and we can see, well, we've got our password policies over here on the right-hand side. Start off with enforce password history. This basically says how many passwords should we remember. The idea here is that we don't want people reusing the same password over and over. For instance, we don't want them flopping back and forth between monkey 1 and monkey 2, because then that makes it really easy to guess. Well, if I'm a hacker and I know that they're flopping back between two passwords, if they're not logging in as monkey 1, they're probably logging in as monkey 2. So by having 24 passwords to be remembered, that means that it's most likely going to be a completely new password by the time they get to number 24. Maximum password age. By default, it is 42 days. This means every 42 days, the end user will be prompted to change their password. Now, 42 days is fairly low. Most companies I've been in, we go in and we edit this, and we will set this to 90 days. Oddly enough, nowadays, they're actually saying, clear that out. Have no maximum password age if you have other security aspects securing your environment and securing your passwords. If you're just a plain old Windows domain and you're not connected up into any cloud services that help protect your users, 90 days is probably the maximum you'd want to set it at. So that's the maximum age, or how long they can keep their password until they have to reset it. There's also a minimum password age, or how long they have to have a password before they can change it. Now, a minimum password age actually ties in very neatly with this enforce password history. The idea is that, okay, if I have to have 24 different passwords. If I have to change my password 24 times before I can reuse the same password, if this is set to 0 days, well, I can just go ahead and change my password 24 times and then get back to the same password I had before, essentially defeating the purpose of changing your password altogether. So by having a minimum password age of at least 1 day, then that means if you wanted to go back to your original password, you would have to change it for 24 days in a row, at which point it's just easier to remember a new password. See, minimum password length. How long should a password be? 7 characters is actually considered to be fairly low. 7 characters are considered to be fairly quick and easy to attack. Therefore, you will probably want to increase this to at least 10, if not higher. Password must meet complexity requirements. If I open this up, there is actually an explanation here that talks about what the complexity requirements are. And let's see, they are, that has to be an uppercase character, a lowercase character, a digit, and a non-alphabetic character, such as a symbol. And you have to have 3 of those 4 in any password. So for instance, if I use the password 01, well, that is in fact 10 characters. So that's meeting my password length. It has an uppercase character, it has lowercase characters, and it has numbers. So it meets 3 of the 4 requirements, which is the complexity requirement that is required on this domain. That is enabled by default. You almost always want that to be enabled by default. And then store passwords using reversible encryption. This is disabled by default. There are very, very few applications and systems that will request you to change that. That is a huge security risk. Don't do it. So those are the overall password policies. These help define how a user can have a password, when they change it, how frequently they change it, and how they can change it. Similar to that is also the account lockout policy. Now the account lockout policy, only 3 options. First one, account lockout threshold. If we look at the explanation here, basically it says how long an account should be locked when it is locked. We'll come back to this one here in a second. Let's actually go to the second one, account lockout threshold. The idea behind here is that if somebody tries to log in as me, they're not going to know my password right off on the first try. Hopefully. There may be some guessing of, well, let's see, his favorite color was purple, right? So I'm going to try purple as a password. Oh, his favorite animal is a lynx. So I'm going to try typing in lynx as a password. So there might be some guessing as to what my password is. The account lockout threshold says, well, once I've reached so many invalid attempts, I'm going to lock out their passwords. I'm going to lock out their account for a certain amount of time so that people can't just keep guessing at this account. Most places I've seen will set this to a default of 3. The idea behind 3 attempts is, oh wait, I tried it once myself and I forgot. I just changed my password, right? My password changed yesterday. I forgot. I just went zombie mode and typed in my old password. It didn't work the first time. Okay, well now let's type the new password. So that's one failed attempt. Then let's type in the new password, but I typo it. So that's 2 failed attempts. On the 3rd attempt, hopefully I will get it in right. If it goes beyond that, such as in the case of somebody guessing at my password, it will then lock out my account. So we'll go ahead and say okay. And this says, hey, you know what? You need to set some other things here. We're going to default these to 30 minutes. Great. Okay, so with that being said, so the account lockout threshold has been defined, which then brings us back up to this prior line, the account lockout threshold. That says that if I've now reached 3 invalid login attempts, go ahead and lock out this account for 30 minutes. Okay, 30 minutes. So even if this is a legitimate, like I completely forgot my password, then I as an end user know, well, within 30 minutes, my password will be available to me again. And then the last option here, a reset account lockout counter after 30 minutes. That is actually paired with that 3 attempts. That means 3 attempts within 30 minutes. So if I try my password and I fail, I then go and get a cup of coffee and I come again and I try the password and I fail again. And then I go talk to a coworker and come back and try my password. If it's been less than 30 minutes, when I type in my password for the 3rd time and I fail, it will lock me out. If it's been more than 30 minutes since my very first attempt, then it will still fail because I'm still typing in the wrong password, but it won't lock out the account because it has to all be within 30 minutes. Well, let's take a look at some of this actions in real life. So right now we have, let's see, 24 passwords. This is all pretty much the default. The only thing I changed was the maximum password age, and then I added an account lockout. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into Active Directory. Actually, let me close that. That will actually save it for me. Then I'm going to go into Active Directory users and computers. I'm going to create 2 users. New user. Let's see, test user 1. We'll call this guy test user 1. Very, very simple password of password 01. And next, if I type in properly. And then I will create a user of test user 2. Oops. Same password, password 01. And next. So I unchecked the must change password at next login simply because we're going to be demonstrating changing of the passwords. All right, so I've got another computer here. This computer is joined to the domain. We will see he is in the domain test2016.local. He's not actually a domain controller. That's just the machine's name. While I'm here, I am going to add those 2 users as administrators on this computer for nothing else other than just to make sure that there's no issues with joining those users in or having those users log in. All right, with that being done, now those users can log into this machine. Let's try to do that. First off, let's log out as my administrator. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to log in first off as test user 2. He is my sacrificial user. I'm going to lock out his account. So let's see, other user, logging into the domain, test user 2. And I'm going to just give bad passwords here. As you can see, I'm just throwing garbage up there. That's 1 attempt. Another bad password. That's 2 attempts. And now, actually before we do that, before we actually click submit, let's go back to our domain controller. I'll open up a command prompt. And this should be able to show us, let's see, net user test user 2 /domain. This tells me about the account, says it is currently active. Great. I now try the 3rd login attempt. Incorrect. Now if we go back to the domain controller, so that's 3 failed login attempts within 30 minutes. Now if I run my net user test user 2 /domain, I will see under account active, it is now locked. So that lock setting for 3 failed attempts did kick in after the 3 failed attempts and will stay locked for the next 30 minutes. If I need to, come on. I can come in here under test user 2 and I can say properties under account. I can click unlock account and then enable the user again. And now when I look at it, the account is now active. There we go. So that was my sacrificial account, locking him out and then unlocking him. All right, let's go ahead and log in as test user 1. My super secret password 01. Great. So we looked at how the account lockout works. Now let's look at account passwords. Let's look at changing the passwords here. Let's see. First off, let's make this bigger. There we go. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Control-Delete, and I'm going to say change password. So this is currently test user 1. His current password, password 01. Right. His new password, I'm going to make password 02. And then click next, and it tells me, no, you can't do this. Specifically, it says the values provided for the new password does not meet the length, complexity, or history requirements of the domain. In this particular case, there's actually one other requirement that's not listed, which is the time since last changed. This user account was just created like 5 minutes ago, and therefore its password is only 5 minutes old. And therefore we can't change the password because it has a minimum of 1 day. Well, let's confirm that. If I cancel that, let's go back to our domain controller. I'm going to go back into our group policy editor and let's re-edit the default domain policy. Come on in under the Windows, security, account policies, and password policies. Minimum password age, I'm going to change this to 0. Do not do this in a production environment. This is simply a lab environment that is demonstrating the fact that the minimum password age can be changed and what it does. All right, back into my other server. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to open up a command prompt. Actually, I'm going to open up a command prompt, but I'm going to open it up as an administrator. And I'm going to run the command gp update /force. gp update updates the group policies on this computer. /force means don't just look to see if there's an update or an updated version of group policies. Go out to the domain controller and forcibly download the latest version. With that being done, I'm going to run rsop.msc. It's the resultant set of policies management console snap-in. When this opens up, what it does is it looks through all of the group policies that might be applied to this computer and tells me what's currently set. So here I can see, yes, this is test user 1 on DC2. If I look under the Windows settings and the account policies, I will see minimum password age has been updated on this computer to 0. That's great. That's what we expected. In more complex environments with multiple domain controllers, that might not always be as quick. So now I can go ahead and I can change my password. Change password from password 01 to password 02. Let's confirm that. Yep. And password 02. Did I type that correctly? No, I did not. There we go. And then next, and it says my password has successfully changed. So there we go. We can see how we can actually change the group policies in order to change the end user password policies. The only thing to note is when you're looking into these group policies objects specific with policies, specific to the password policies, is that there can only be one in the entire domain. And what that means is there are exceptions to it, but generally, as far as these password settings and the account lockout settings, you can only really set this in one place, which is generally in the default domain policies. So if you have a general baseline of what you want the majority of the people in your organization to meet, this is where you would specify it. If you want everybody in your company to have a minimum 7-character password, that is where you would want to start. Minimum password age, maximum password age, and complexity requirements, and so on, you would specify them in the default domain policy. In another video, I'll talk about how you can actually go over this and create some exceptions. However, the general rule is you have one password policy for the entire company.